Welcome back to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and today we need to completely recalibrate your understanding of how the world works. I know that sounds like a tagline, but I mean it. I really mean it literally. We are going to talk about war, but if you're picturing trenches or drone strikes or guys in fatigue storming a beach, you are looking at the wrong map.
It's a total paradigm shift. We're
Yeah.
conditioned by, history books and Hollywood to see power as kinetic. It's things that explode.
Right.
It's aircraft carriers parking off a coast. But the story we're unpacking today argues that the most lethal weapon of the 21st century, it makes absolutely no sound when it's fired.
And the generals aren't soldiers, they're lawyers, they're, bureaucrats in gray suits sitting in fluorescent lit offices in Washington, D.C., just typing on keyboards. We are diving into the book, Chokepoints, How the Global Economy Became a Weapon of War by Edward Fitchman. And the central premise here is that the global economy, the very thing we were told was a tool for peace and connection, has been quietly rewired into a battlefield.
And not just a battlefield, but a trap. That's the choke point concept.
Let's start with a visual, because this concept can feel, well, a little abstract until you see the consequences. I want to take you back to a very specific date, December 5th, 2022. We are in Istanbul, Turkey. We are standing on the banks of the Bosphorus Strait.
Which, for context, is one of the most critical arteries in the world. I mean, it's that narrow slash of water that separates Europe from Asia, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It's legendary.
It is. And on this specific Tuesday, if you looked out at the water, you saw a parking lot. Just a maritime traffic jam of epic proportions. We are talking about a line of colossal oil tankers. These are vessels that are 1,000 feet long. They're basically floating skyscrapers, just idling there.
Just sitting there.
Miles of steel, engines humming, going absolutely nowhere.
And you have to understand, the Bosphorus is a pilot's nightmare on a good day. It has fierce, twisting currents. It has these sharp bends where you can't see oncoming traffic. And it runs right through the heart of a city of 15 million people.
So having that many huge ships stuck there it's not just an inconvenience.
It's incredibly dangerous. It spells disaster for the global energy market, but it's also a potential environmental catastrophe waiting to happen.
So naturally, your first thought is something physical happened. Is there a battleship blocking the channel? Did a ship run aground and block the path? Like the Ever Given did in the Suez Canal?
But the water was clear, the weather was fine, there were no battleships, no accidents.
The force that stopped these massive steel leviathans dead in the water wasn't physical, it was text. Specifically, a few paragraphs of regulatory jargon published on a website 5,000 miles away by the U.S. Treasury Department. This was the debut of the price cap on Russian oil.
It's a perfect, almost cinematic example of the invisible infrastructure we're going to be talking about.
Okay, let's unpack this price cap because it sounds like boring financial news, but it caused a physical gridlock. How do words on a screen in D.C. physically stop a ship in Turkey?
This is the core mechanism of the book. So, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the West wanted to punish Putin economically. They wanted to cut off his oil revenue. But they had a very delicate problem.
Russia is an energy giant.
A giant. If the West simply banned Russian oil completely, just turned off the tap, global supply would crater.
And prices would skyrocket. We'd be seeing, $150 or $200 a barrel oil. Gas prices in Ohio would hit $7. The Western economy would crash, and voters they'd revolt.
Exactly. It would be an economic suicide pact. So the Treasury economists, they got creative. They came up with this price cap. The rule was Russian oil is allowed to flow to global markets. We won't stop it. But it can only be sold if the price is less than $60 a barrel.
So it's a forced discount. You can sell your oil, Vladimir, but you can't make a real profit on it. We're capping your upside.
Precisely. But here's the problem. How do you enforce a price rule on a ship sailing from a Russian port to, say, India? The U.S. Navy isn't going to board every tanker to check the invoice. The ocean is just too big.
And that's where the choke point comes in.
They targeted the insurance. It turns out that about 90 to 95% of the world's ocean-going vessels are insured by a very specific group of companies based in the UK or the EU. They're called the P&I clubs in London.
And you can't sail without that insurance.
You cannot legally enter most ports or traverse most straits, like the Bosphorus, without this high-level liability insurance.
Because if you spill oil, the cleanup costs billions. The port authorities want to know you're covered. You need that gold standard coverage.
Exactly right. So the regulation simply said, Western companies are prohibited from insuring any ship carrying Russian oil if that oil was sold above the $60 cap.
And that's why the ship stopped in Turkey.
That's it. The Turkish authorities are terrified of an oil spill in the Bosphorus. I mean, if a tanker crashes and spills in the middle of Istanbul, it's an unthinkable catastrophe.
Yeah.
So when this rule kicked in at 12:01 a.m., Turkish officials stopped every single ship and demanded proof that their insurance was valid under the new rules.
And the insurers couldn't provide it.
They couldn't provide it instantly because they had to verify the price of the oil, and boom, gridlock.
That is the aha moment. You have a physical choke point, the strait being strangled by a legal and financial choke point constructed by bureaucrats.
And this brings us right to Fishman's central thesis. To understand modern power, you have to stop looking at maps of land and start looking at maps of networks. Though, historically, this isn't an entirely new idea.
I have a feeling you're going to bring up the Peloponnesian War. You love a good Greek analogy.
It's the perfect historical rhyme. Look at ancient Athens. It was the superpower of its day, right? The center of culture, democracy, philosophy. But Athens had a fatal vulnerability.
Yeah.
It couldn't feed itself. It relied on grain imported from the fertile fields of, and this is the incredible part, Ukraine and Crimea.
The same geography we are literally discussing today.
The exact same. And all that grain had to pass through the Bosphorus to get to Athens. Sparta, their rival, eventually won the war not by burning down Athens directly.
They didn't storm the Acropolis.
No. They won by sailing their navy to the Bosphorus and cutting the throat of that grain supply.
They starved them out. A classic geographic choke point.
Right. But what Fishman argues is that in the 21st century, the geography of conflict has shifted. We aren't just fighting over straits and canals anymore. The new choke points are in the server rooms of banks in New York, the fiber optic cables of the Swift messaging system in Belgium, and the clean rooms where semiconductor chips are manufactured in Taiwan and the Netherlands.
And the U.S. has built what Fishman calls an invisible infrastructure of economic warfare on top of these specific nodes.
Which is fascinating because that was never the plan.
No, not at all. It was the complete opposite. This leads us into section 1 of our deep dive. The architecture. How did we even get here? Because if we go back to the 90s, the narrative wasn't about war. It was about how globalization would end war.
The end of history.
Mm-hmm.
Francis Fukuyama. The
Yeah.
Berlin Wall was down. The Soviet Union was gone. There was this euphoria. You had this theory, the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention.
Which was what, exactly? If two countries both have McDonald's, they won't fight each other.
That was essentially it, yeah. The logic was that trade creates interdependence. If I rely on you for my car parts, and you rely on me for your oil, war becomes too expensive. It becomes economically irrational.
So you had major figures like Alan Greenspan, the Fed chair, who really believed this.
He really did. Greenspan believed that market forces were becoming more powerful than governments. He thought the market was this sort of autonomous machine that would regulate itself and, by extension, enforce peace.
And you had the architects actually building the plumbing for this machine, people like Walter Wriston, the CEO of Citibank.
Wriston was a visionary. He famously said, "Information about money has become almost as important as money itself." He was the one who built the global electronic infrastructure that allowed capital to move around the world at the speed of light.
The Internet of Money.
He thought he was building a decentralized system, a flat world, in Thomas Friedman's terms, where governments couldn't interfere with the free flow of capital.
But here is the tragic irony for those libertarians of the 90s. They thought they were building a distributed web, like a spider web with no center. But networks naturally form hubs. They have nodes. Efficiency demands centralization. And if you control the central node...
You control the entire network.
And the central node, in this case, is the U.S. dollar.
The dollar is the ultimate choke point.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to really drill down on why, because people often misunderstand this. It's not just that people trust the dollar. It's a structural necessity.
I was looking at the data in the notes. Something like 60% of all central bank reserves are held in dollars.
Yep.
The euro is, what, around 20%?
20%. And the Chinese renminbi is barely 3%.
Yeah.
It's not even a contest. But it goes deeper than reserves. It's about transactions. Fishman uses this great analogy of a passport.
Right.
If you want to travel internationally, you legally need a passport. You can't just walk across a border. If you want to trade internationally, buy oil, sell steel, ship bulk merchandise, you effectively need dollars. It is the operating system of global commerce.
But here is the mechanism I've always found a little confusing, and the book explains it so well. Let's say a bank in France wants to send dollars to a bank in Japan, two allies. Why does the U.S. government get involved in that? Why is it their business?
This is the concept of clearing. And it is the secret weapon. It's the linchpin of the whole system. When a French bank sends dollars to a Japanese bank, they don't put cash on a plane, it's a digital message. But because the dollar is a U.S. currency, the ultimate ledger for dollars resides in the United States.
So the message has to phone home.
Correct. That digital transaction almost always routes through a correspondent bank in New York to be cleared. It's called a U-turn transaction. It enters the U.S. financial system and leaves it milliseconds later.
But in that millisecond, it's on U.S. territory.
In that millisecond, the money is technically on U.S. soil. And because it is on U.S. soil, it is subject to U.S. law.
That is just incredible reach. It's like a digital toll booth that the entire world economy has to pass through, and the toll collector is the U.S. Treasury.
And that toll collector has the power to lower the gate whenever it wants. There is a famous quote from a Treasury secretary telling his foreign counterparts, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem."
Meaning, we control the pipes. You just live in the house.
That's it.
So the infrastructure is built in the 90s with this, peaceful globalist intent, but it wasn't weaponized immediately. The intent changed on a specific day, September 11th, 2001.
9/11 changed absolutely everything. Before that, financial crime was about catching drug lords or tax cheats. After the towers fell, there was this frantic realization that the terrorists weren't just guys in caves with satellite phones. They were using the formal banking system to move money, to fund the flight lessons, to buy the box cutters. They were integrated. So the Patriot Act gets passed, and the Patriot Act gave the government sweeping new powers to surveil finance. This birthed a new breed of warrior. Fishman calls them the gorillas in gray suits.
I love that image. It's so perfect.
It's accurate. We're talking about people like Juan Zarate, who helped create the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, or a TFI. These aren't commandos. They are lawyers in Brooks Brothers suits, and they're just looking at spreadsheets, hunting for vulnerabilities in the banking ledger.
And they ran a proof of concept in 2005 that really proved this whole theory worked. The target was North Korea.
The Banco Delta Asia case. This is really the origin story of modern sanctions. Banco Delta Asia was a tiny, family-run bank in Macau. The U.S. Treasury accused it of laundering money for North Korea, things like counterfeit $100 bills, drug money. So they designated a primary money laundering concern.
Now, usually you'd think the U.S. would sanction North Korea directly, but they went after this tiny bank instead.
They issued a warning. They told the world's banks, if you touch Banco Delta Asia, you cannot touch the U.S. financial system. It was a simple ultimatum.
And the reaction?
Panic. Total abject panic. Dozens of banks across the world, banks that had nothing to do with the U.S., banks that probably didn't even know where Macau was, immediately cut ties with Banco Delta Asia. They were terrified of losing their dollar access.
They self-sanctioned to protect themselves.
And North Korea suddenly found its accounts frozen. We aren't talking about billions here. The total amount frozen was about $25 million.
Which, as the notes point out, is roughly what Shaquille O'Neal made playing basketball that year. It's basically pocket change for a nation.
For a normal nation, sure. But for the North Korean regime, that was their slush fund. That was the money Kim Jong-il used to buy loyalty from his generals and to buy luxury cognac for himself. It paralyzed them. A North Korean official actually admitted to an American diplomat later. He said, "You finally found a way to hurt us."
So the weapon is live. The proof of concept worked. But North Korea is a hermit kingdom. It's already isolated. The real test, the big question, was whether this could work against a real economy.
And that brings us to Section 2, the laboratory, the economic war on Iran.
This was the mid-2000s. I remember the geopolitical tension. Iran's nuclear program is accelerating. The Bush administration is stuck. They don't want another war in the Middle East after Iraq. The public appetite just wasn't there, but they can't let Iran get the bomb.
And traditional sanctions were, frankly, a joke. In the 90s, European companies ignored U.S. sanctions routinely. Total, the French energy giant, basically told the U.S. to get lost when Washington tried to tell them not to invest in Iran. There was no enforcement mechanism.
So what changed? Why did the Europeans suddenly start listening?
Because of a few innovators at the Treasury, specifically Stuart Levy and Adam Subin, we can call them the sanctions technocrats. They realized that instead of trying to ban trade by getting the UN to agree, which is impossible because Russia and China have vetoes, they could target the financial plumbing directly. They could weaponize the private sector's own risk aversion.
This is the birth of secondary sanctions. We hear this term a lot in the news, but I think people get confused by it. Can we define it really clearly?
It's crucial to understand the distinction. A primary sanction is American companies can't trade with Iran. Simple enough. A secondary sanction is the U.S. saying to a French bank, "You are a sovereign entity. We can't tell you what to do. If you want to handle money for Iran, go ahead. But if you do, you lose your access to the U.S. financial system. You lose your correspondent banking accounts in New York."
So the choice is do business with Iran or do business with America. But you cannot do both.
And for a global bank like Deutsche Bank or BNP Paribas, that is not a choice. It's a death sentence to lose dollar access. You would cease to function as a global bank. So almost overnight, Iran found itself financially radioactive. Banks dropped them. Shipping companies dropped them. Insurance companies dropped them. The Treasury didn't even have to fine anyone. The threat was enough.
But Iran is an oil superpower. They have liquid gold coming out of the ground. Surely they could still sell oil.
They could sell it, but they couldn't get paid for it. This was the nuclear option of financial war, targeting the Central Bank of Iran.
The CBI. Now, initially, the Treasury was scared to do this, right?
Terrified. There was a long-standing belief, a taboo, that central banks were sacrosanct. You don't sanction a sovereign nation's central bank. They worried it would spike oil prices or, break the global financial system entirely.
But Congress pushed them into it.
The Menendez-Kirk Amendment. And the solution they came up with was, frankly, brilliant. Fishman calls it black magic.
How did it work?
They created a trap. They told countries like China and India and South Korea, you can keep buying some Iranian oil. We won't stop you. We need to keep oil prices stable. But you cannot pay Iran in dollars. You cannot send the money to Tehran. You have to deposit the payment into an escrow account in your own country in your local currency.
Okay, so the money, say, sits in a bank in Beijing in yuan.
And here is the kicker. Iran can only use that money to buy humanitarian goods, food, medicine from that specific country. They can't transfer it. They can't convert it into other currencies. They can't use it to fund their nuclear program.
So billions and billions of dollars piled up in these accounts that Iran could see on a screen but couldn't actually touch.
Exactly. It was statue money. Iran was rich on paper, but completely broke in reality. It cratered their currency. It caused hyperinflation. And it ultimately forced them to the negotiating table, which led to the JCPOA nuclear deal.
It proved you could bring a significant power to its knees without firing a single shot. It turned the toothless tiger of sanctions into a boa constrictor.
But the targets just kept getting bigger and more integrated. Iran was already a pariah state. What happens when you try to use these weapons against a G20 economy, a country that is deeply, deeply integrated into Europe?
That's Section 3, the scalpel, Russia, 2014.
Putin annexes Crimea. He invades the Donbass. The West has to respond, but they can't just do what they did to Iran. If you unplug Russia completely from the financial system, the lights go out in Berlin and Paris because of the gas dependence. The integration was just too deep.
So they needed a precision weapon, a scalpel. Fishman quotes the diplomat Dan Fried on this strategy. Thrust the bayonet. When you hit fat, keep pushing. When you hit steel, pull back.
Visceral, but very accurate. The Obama administration, with folks like Dilip Singh, who is a key character here, designed what they called sectoral sanctions. Instead of a sledgehammer, they used a scalpel. They didn't block Russian banks entirely. They restricted their access to long-term debt.
Why focus on debt maturity? That seems so obscure, so technical.
It's how modern corporations breathe. Big companies like Rosneft or Gazprom don't pay for everything with cash on hand. They issue bonds. They borrow money to pay for operations, and when that debt comes due, they roll it over. They borrow new money to pay off the old debt. It's a constant cycle.
Like paying off one credit card with another credit card, but on a massive scale.
Roughly, yes. The sanctions made it illegal for Western investors to buy any new Russian corporate debt with a maturity of more than 30 or 90 days. This meant Russian companies couldn't roll over their loans. They faced a massive slow-motion liquidity crunch. It was designed to slowly strangle them, not kill them overnight.
And then they got lucky. Or I guess Russia got unlucky.
Extremely unlucky. At the exact same time the sanctions hit in late 2014, the price of oil collapsed globally due to unrelated market forces. It was a perfect storm, a double whammy. The ruble went into an absolute freefall, losing 50% of its value in a matter of weeks.
But Russia didn't collapse, and this is where we meet the antagonist of our story, or maybe the hero, depending on your perspective, Elvira Nabiullina.
The governor of the Central Bank of Russia. She is a brilliant, steely technocrat. When the ruble crashed, she didn't panic. She made a very tough, very painful call. She hiked interest rates aggressively, all the way up to 17% in the middle of the night.
That is incredibly painful for the average Russian. Mortgages go up, business loans get prohibitively expensive.
It was brutal. It threw the economy into recession, but it stopped the capital flight. She also spent billions of dollars in foreign reserves to prop up the currency. She essentially saved Putin's regime from financial collapse.
And she was even named Central Banker of the Year by Western magazines for it.
The irony is thick, yes. She was praised for her orthodox response while she was actively fighting an economic war against the West.
So the scalpel hurt, but it didn't kill. Russia stagnated for years, but Putin stayed in power and kept his ambitions.
Correct. And while this financial war was playing out, a whole new front was opening up. A front that wasn't about money, but about the machinery of the future.
Section 4, the Tech War. This is where the story shifts from the banks of New York to the factories of Silicon Valley and Taiwan.
Under the Trump administration, and continuing pretty seamlessly under Biden, the U.S. realized that it had another, perhaps even more powerful, choke point. The U.S. and its allies control the actual physical technology needed to build the modern world. Semiconductors.
The chips, the brains in everything from your toaster to a hypersonic missile.
The realization was China is rising. You can't sanction China financially in the same way you did Iran or Russia. They're too big. They hold too much U.S. debt. They're too integrated.
Yeah.
But they have an Achilles heel. They need our chips. They can't make the most advanced ones themselves.
This all started with the panic over Huawei and 5G, right?
It did. The fear in Washington was that Huawei would build the backbone of the global internet, the Internet of Things, autonomous cars.
Yeah.
And that would give China a backdoor into every network on Earth, a massive security threat. But how do you stop a company that massive?
Enter the Foreign Direct Product Rule, or the FDPR. This is another one of those acronyms that sounds incredibly boring, but is actually a superpower.
It is the nuclear option of export controls.
Yeah.
Here's how it works, and it's kind of mind-blowing. Usually, U.S. laws only apply to U.S. exports, but the FDPR says if a product is made in a foreign country by a foreign company, but it is made using American tools or American software or American blueprints, then the U.S. government claims jurisdiction over that product.
Okay, let me make sure I'm getting this straight. If a factory in Taiwan, say TSMC, is making chips for a Chinese company like Huawei, but that factory uses a piece of chip-making equipment that was designed in California, the U.S. can say, stop.
Yes. And here's the catch. You literally cannot make advanced chips without American tools. Companies like Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, they have a near monopoly on the most critical pieces of equipment. So the U.S. effectively said, if you use our hammers to build a house, we decide who gets to live in it.
We saw this play out with ZTE in 2018.
ZTE was the test case. They were caught violating Iran sanctions. The Commerce Department, under Wilbur Ross, issued a denial order. They cut them off from all U.S. tech. And ZTE, a massive telecom company, nearly died in a matter of weeks.
They couldn't get chips from Qualcomm?
They couldn't use the Android operating system from Google. Their factories shut down. Their phones became bricks.
Trump eventually saved them as a sort of favor to Xi Jinping, but the message was sent loud and clear.
And then they applied that same weapon to Huawei in 2020. They cut Huawei off from its main chip supplier, TSMC. Huawei's revenue plummeted. They were forced to sell off their successful smartphone brand, Honor. It basically broke their knees.
And then, in October 2022, the Biden administration took it even further with what are called the October 7th measures.
This was the big escalation. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, called this the small yard, high fence strategy. The goal was no longer just to stay a generation ahead of China in technology. The goal was to actively freeze China's development in key areas like AI and supercomputing, to say, you shall not pass this line.
There is one specific company that plays a starring role in this part of the story, ASML.
The choke point within a choke point. ASML is a Dutch company. They are the only company in the world, literally the only one, that makes a machine called an EUV lithography machine.
Describe these machines for us. They sound like something out of science fiction.
They pretty much are. They are the size of a city bus. They cost over $150 million each. They work by firing a high-powered laser at a microscopic droplet of molten tin 50,000 times a second to generate extreme ultraviolet light, which then etches the circuits onto the silicon wafer.
It sounds impossible.
They are the most complex machines humans have ever built. And without them, you simply cannot make the cutting-edge chips that run AI or advanced military hardware.
And the U.S. leaned on the Dutch government to stop ASML from selling these machines to China.
Correct. So China has the money. They have the smart engineers. But they physically cannot get the tool they need to advance. And it's much harder to evade than financial sanctions. You can smuggle a suitcase of cash. Smuggling a bus-sized machine that requires a team of PhDs to install and operate, much, much harder.
Okay, so we have the financial weapons, finely honed. We have the tech weapons, which are incredibly powerful. And then comes February 2022. Russia launches its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the West decides to empty the entire magazine.
Section 5. The sledgehammer.
We all remember the buildup. The intelligence reports were everywhere. But Putin was confident he'd spent years building what he called Fortress Russia.
He had spent 8 years since the 2014 sanctions preparing for this very moment. He built up $630 billion in foreign reserves, gold, dollars, euros. He thought, let them sanction us. I have a war chest that can last for years.
He thought he was sanction-proof, like Scrooge McDuck swimming in a vault of gold coins.
But he made a fatal, fundamental error. He misunderstood the nature of modern money. He thought his reserves were money in a physical vault in Moscow. But in the 21st century, money is data. Russia's reserves were mostly digital entries sitting on the ledgers of Western central banks. The Fed in New York, the ECB in Frankfurt, the Bank of France, the Bank of England.
So when the tanks crossed the border,
The West did something truly unprecedented, something that was considered unthinkable just weeks earlier. They sanctioned the Central Bank of Russia. They froze its assets.
I remember reading that Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, was very hesitant about this.
She was. She's a traditionalist, and for good reason. She worried that weaponizing central bank reserves would break the fundamental trust in the dollar as a neutral asset. It violates something economists call the impossible trinity, the rule that you can't have free capital movement, a fixed exchange rate, and independent monetary policy all at once. By freezing the reserves, the West was essentially telling Russia its financial sovereignty was gone.
But the moral urgency of the war just overrode the economic caution.
It did. And just like that, with a keystroke, over $300 billion, more than half of Putin's entire war chest vanished.
It was just immobilized.
Immobilized. He couldn't access it. He couldn't use it to prop up the ruble. The currency crashed almost immediately. There were long lines at ATMs in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The fortress had a massive, gaping hole in the wall he never saw coming.
But as we discussed in the intro, there was still the oil and gas problem. Europe was still buying Russian energy because they needed to heat their homes.
That was the great dilemma. How do you stop Putin's revenue without stopping the flow of oil, which would crash your own economy? And that's where the idea for the price cap came from. We circle right back to the Bosphorus traffic jam.
So where does this leave us now? We have unleashed these incredible, powerful weapons. We have frozen central banks, cut off critical technology, strangled supply chains. What is the fallout? What are the consequences?
Section 6, the rupture. The global economy is, well, it's fragmenting.
You mentioned the shadow fleet of tankers, but it's not just ships. I read in the book about the ghost ships in China.
The smuggling is rampant. There's a wild story in the book about a woman caught at the Chinese border. She looked pregnant, but inside the fake silicone belly, she wasn't carrying a baby. She was carrying hundreds of advanced computer chips taped together.
That is dystopian cyberpunk stuff made real.
It is. But more importantly, countries are reacting strategically. China is stockpiling gold. Physical gold, not digital entries on a server. They are aggressively pushing the digital yuan. They are trying to build alternatives to the SWIFT messaging system, like their CIPS system. They're trying to build a parallel universe.
So, is the dollar dying? We hear this every year. The end of dollar hegemony is nigh.
Fishman argues, not yet. There is still Tina. There is no alternative. The euro is too politically fragmented. The yuan is controlled by an autocracy that traps capital. Nobody trusts it. Investors still, for now, trust the U.S. rule of law more than anything else.
But he does give a pretty severe warning.
A very severe one. He says the real threat to the dollar isn't China, it's us. It's U.S. domestic dysfunction. If we politicize the Fed, if we default on our debt because of political brinksmanship in Congress, that is what will kill the dollar. Trust is incredibly hard to build and frighteningly easy to lose.
And we are already seeing retaliation in this economic war. China controls the processing of critical minerals like gallium and germanium,
which are essential for making semiconductors and solar panels. They have started restricting exports of those materials. It's a tit-for-tat escalation. We are moving from a world of just-in-time efficiency to just-in-case security. We are friendshoring, moving our critical supply chains to countries we trust, even if it's more expensive.
Which brings us to the outro, the impossible trinity, not of economics, but of the modern world.
We have come such a long way from the 90s. We went from the Golden Arches theory of peace to war by economic means. The great irony is that the legacy of the neoliberal era, that invisible infrastructure built to connect us, is now the very thing that is being used to tear us apart.
It's a stunning paradox. The ropes that were supposed to bind us all together are now being used as garrotes to strangle each other.
And here is the provocative final thought that Fishman leaves us with. Just step back and look at the actual results. Did sanctioning the Russian central bank stop the tanks in Ukraine?
No, the war is still grinding on, horrifically.
Did the sanctions on Iran stop their centrifuges from spinning permanently?
No, the program is reportedly advancing again.
So we are burning down the bridge of globalization. We are weaponizing the entire global economy. We are creating a poorer, more fragmented, and arguably more dangerous world. And for what? If these tools don't actually stop the war, are we just making ourselves less prosperous and more prone to actual kinetic conflict in the long run?
That is the heavy, heavy question. We are building these small yards with high fences, but are we just trapping ourselves inside them?
That is the great gamble of the 21st century.
I want to leave our listeners with a final challenge, something to think about. Look at your phone in your hand. Look at the gas pump the next time you fill up your car. Ask yourself, how much of what I am touching right now depends on a supply chain that is currently being weaponized? And are you ready for the cost if that chain snaps?
It's the invisible war, and it turns out we are all on the battlefield.
Thanks for guiding us through the plumbing of modern power. This has been The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.